So, before I start, I'm sorry, maybe I missed that. I just wanted to know, like, how many of you are actual admins? How many of you are admins? Okay. Yeah, admins of Salesforce. How many of you are developers? How many of you are architects?
One certified.
How many? Yeah. How many of you are like in sales or like in? How many of you have a free food? Great. Yeah. No, I just wanted to understand, because I don't want to present something which is not even relevant to you, right? So, yeah. Thank you for that. So very quickly, I will just skip to the agenda. So introduction, so basically why we have having this session is, again, from time to time, I know Salesforce is a great tool, but it is also limited to what it does, right? And there are always other different tools which you use for different things, for which Salesforce is not best suited. For example, you have QuickBooks for accounting, or let's say you have Twilio for texting, but that is not talking to Salesforce anyhow, right? And there is requirements, coming in where you need to integrate these third-party systems to Salesforce. Or let's say if you're a big enterprise, right, and you are not just using Salesforce, but you are also using SAP, Oracle, or any other system, right? And you want to somehow bring the data back to Salesforce. So this presentation or this whole presentation is all about designing the whole integration, designing the whole solution, right? So as I said, it covers both things: legacy systems like Oracle, SAP, how you can integrate them, and then the third-party integrations with softwares like QuickBooks, GoToMeeting, Shopify, you name it, right? So kind of this session covers how you can integrate anything and everything with Salesforce. All right. Okay, so first of all, talking about the easy route, right? Of course, we always try to do the easy route. So talking about the legacy system, right? So Salesforce does have a pretty powerful tool called Salesforce Connect, which is a paid tool from Salesforce add-on, which you can install, which you can buy the license on. And what it does, it basically pulls the data from your legacy system to Salesforce. So it doesn't pull the data to Salesforce, but it only keeps it in Salesforce as a view mode. Okay, so you can view the data, you can run the reports on it, you can still edit some of the data, limited. But this tool is basically used when you have like lots and lots of data, and you don't want to bring it to Salesforce, but you still want to access that in Salesforce, right? For example, let's say you're using SAP for order management, and there are like hundreds of thousands of orders, right? And like Salesforce storage is like limited and expensive, and you don't want to fill up your space in Salesforce, but you still want to see all the sales orders in Salesforce. So you can use this tool, Salesforce Connect, which you can install, and you connect your Oracle database or SAP database, and once it's connected, you can actually see all the data right in Salesforce. I know pretty like most of you have seen that. This is like an old tool, not a new thing, but like this example. Accounts is a Salesforce like internal object, but sales order in this case is an external object, which is available in Salesforce, pretty much like a custom object, right? Of course, the other option is App Exchange. You know App Exchange. There are lots and lots of apps available for most of the things, right? So I would say for most of my customers, I am able to find some apps on App Exchange which already do the integrations, right? But of course, not everything is on App Exchange, right? So if there is no existing solution, there's always a first time. So we'll build our own, right? And that's my food, at least, to build these integrations. All right. So so when we start, can you hear me fine without the mic?
Please use the mic.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So now talking about like integration. So let's say if you have a customer, or let's say you have your owner, asking you for integration, right? So as a technical architect or as a designer, what all question you should ask, upfront, before you even think of designing the whole solution, right? So the first thing is, what is the source on target, right? Like from which tool you want to integrate with Salesforce, right? Does the third party system has an API? Because if it doesn't have an API, then it's a different route. If it has an API, then it's a different route. Okay. So now, are we syncing just the data, or are we basically creating the process? So for example, let's take an example. You are creating an opportunity in Salesforce. Once an opportunity is closed won, okay, you want to somehow create an invoice in QuickBooks on the fly, and you want to send it to customer in the same flow. And once the invoice is sent, you want to push it back to Salesforce. So this is the end-to-end process, right? So you need to decide whether you're syncing the process or you are just syncing the data back and forth. All right. Then of course, how many objects and fields you are actually syncing. For the legacy system, it will be like tables and attributes. How many attributes you are syncing. Is it one direction or bi-directional? So are you posting data just from Salesforce to third party or third party to Salesforce, or is it like both ways? They have to be kept in sync all the time, right? What is the timing of each? Like, do you want them to be real time, or you are okay to have it like a nightly job or an hourly job, right? And lastly, like, we have to decide who is the master. What is the master database? Is it Salesforce or is it the third party system? Because that actually it helps to design the whole system. So these are the questions which are very much important in your discovery call, right? So once you have discovered those things, I know like most of you know the integrations, but in this session I'm trying to show some patterns which are already out there, and one of these patterns should fit in your like integration pattern, right? Whichever you want to follow. So the very first thing is like request and reply. So let's as I said, let's take an example of a quick Salesforce with QuickBooks. Okay, so you have to raise an invoice from QuickBooks, but you have to also write it back to Salesforce in the same transaction, right? You click the button, you want to send an invoice through QuickBooks, and you want to write it back to Salesforce in the same transaction. So that is called request and reply, right? You place a request and you wait for the reply, and when the reply is back, you save it back to Salesforce. All right? Am I speaking too fast, or is it fine? It's fine, right? Okay. So the next one is like fire and forget. So for example, let's talk about Twilio, right? So as you know, like if you want to send a SMS from Salesforce, and Salesforce doesn't have a capability to send a SMS, right? To send a text. So far it doesn't have, right? So let's say you want to send a text, so you invoke the Twilio API. So you send a request to Twilio to send a text. Now, as you know, Twilio send the text asynchronously. It doesn't send in real time. So you cannot keep on waiting for Twilio to send the text and send you the confirmation. You just invoke Twilio that please send that text for me, and then that's it. Twilio just acknowledges, yes, I have heard your request. Let's wait for it, right? So this is called fire and forget. Just place a request and just wait for it, right? The third one is, let's say you are just syncing the data back and forth, right? But you don't want to be real time, or let's say you want to have it like a nightly job or something, right? So in that case, we usually do batch data synchronization. So this is like somewhat like using ETL tools and all, right? So like Informatica and other tools which we can use to create those automation syncing, between third-party system and Salesforce, right? And of course, I'm going to elaborate these on the next slides, all right? So the next is remote call-in. Remote call-in is actually on the other way side, where you have to update Salesforce data from a third-party system. So remote call-in is basically you are using Salesforce REST API or SOAP API to update Salesforce records as and when needed. And the last is UI update based on data changes. This is I'm going to cover that. So basically, you create like a subscribe request to this. So it's called streaming API. I'm not sure how many of you have used. Any one of you have used streaming API? Right, some of you, right? So streaming API is, I think, a new thing, right? Which we use. At least for me, it's new. So which we use for. So instead of creating the request and response like multiple times, you just create like a poll request and you subscribe to it. So whenever any action happens on that, you get notified in Salesforce. So it's like another way of doing it. And the good thing about this is you get a lot of requests. It doesn't count with your API limits, so it gives you more requests in the streaming API. So now these are different patterns. We need to decide which pattern we need to pick, right? So this is the first scenario where we are actually talking about pushing data from Salesforce to a third-party system, right? So now again, as I said, are we pushing the process or are we pushing the data? That depends. And is it synchronous or is it asynchronous? So let's say if we are pushing a process from Salesforce to a third-party system in a synchronous way, so we should use a request and reply, because we have to place a request from Salesforce to a third-party system. We have to wait for the response from that, and then we save it back to Salesforce. So for that, we will use a request and reply. For asynchronous, so let's say we just want to notify, as I said in Twilio, we just want to notify the system that please do it for me, but I don't want to wait for the transaction to complete. So for that we will use fire and forget because it's asynchronous, right? For data, if again it's synchronous, it's exactly same as process. I wanted to have it real time in Salesforce. I created a time log in Salesforce. I want to push it to my, let's say, harvest, outside of Salesforce. I want to have it real time. I will use the request and reply. And if it's asynchronous, I don't want data to be synced real time. The best option is to create like a data loader. Like create like it's either streaming API or you can use like a data loader for. You can set the ETL tool for syncing the data. So now talking about the other way side, where you are pushing the data from a third party to Salesforce. So again, if it's asynchronous, you will always use remote call-in, which is typically using the Salesforce REST API or SOAP API or web services, to push data to Salesforce. For asynchronous, again the same thing, because even if you do asynchronous, to push the data to Salesforce, you have to use Salesforce API, right, to push the data. So you will use that. Only the difference is like for the data asynchronous sync, you will use again, as I said, batch data sync, because you don't want data to be sending real time. So you can actually update Salesforce on the batch, right? Of course, before we start on these, you should look into the governor limits. Everyone knows that. But what I've seen is, in complex cases and all, even if we create like a great integration, it always fails because of the governor limits. So let's say you are hitting Salesforce API limit again and again. At the end of the day, your API limits are consumed. So that is very important that you have to save them. Or let's say your SQL queries are like too many in the transaction, or let's say your DML is too many. So while designing this for the large system, you have to make sure of these governor limits. Okay, so as I said, the first one was request and reply. I've tried to put like a real-time example. So again, I've told that. So you had an opportunity, you marked it close one. You want to quickly generate an invoice in QuickBooks, right? So this is one scenario. So for this, you will always use request and reply, right? So as I said, there are like multiple ways of doing that. So I've written them in order of what is the best practice, like what is the best way, and what is like a suboptimal way. So the best case scenario. So imagine like you had an opportunity, it's closed one. You want to raise an invoice in QuickBooks, right? So the first way which I would recommend is, let's say I click the button which says raise invoice. So it should actually open a Visualforce page in which I will enter the data which is required by QuickBooks to create an invoice. And once I click on submit, it should place a request in QuickBooks that the data, like the invoice, has been created successfully or not. If there is a failure, you will get it right away. So it's not posted to Salesforce at all. It's not posted to QuickBooks at all. If there is a failure, you will stop. If it's a success, you will just show a success message. So that is like the best practice. Of course, there's other way of doing that. So what you can do is you can write a trigger that when the opportunity is closed one, you just create an invoice in in QuickBooks. The issue in this is what if the invoice fails? So because your transaction in trigger was not synchronous, it was like a asynchronous, as you know, because you're not waiting for the transaction to complete. So there might be a chance that you actually told QuickBooks to create an invoice, but it failed. So in that case, what happened was the invoice was never created. So your whole flow breaks in this case. So you have to do error handling in this. Okay. However, in Visualforce page, it was easy to do. And then of course you can always use the batch apex, to do that, which is usually for the large chunk of data. So in a day, let's say you are creating like hundreds of thousands of, you are processing like hundreds of orders, and you don't want to invoke the third-party system like on each transaction. You just send them in a chunk of 200, in let's say nightly job and hourly job. So far so good? Like, you guys still awake or sleeping? All right, yeah.
Yeah, so the second one up there, suboptimal, I could envision a scenario where maybe like somebody does some data loader job and they wipe out the invoice ID and it causes these things to all refire and you like create duplicate invoices too. So another reason why the backend trigger might be suboptimal, because it might be a little too automated in the sense that it's working in non-interactive mode where data loader jobs.
Right, exactly. So the best solution is, as I said, to have it on the screen, So this is the diagram which shows the same thing, so of course you has a user browser, you place a request, okay, from Visualforce. Of course Visualforce has an Apex controller which actually called your, so let's say in this case I'm using a SOAP API. So from the SOAP API I have consumed the SOAP API WSDL in Salesforce, so which has generated a proxy Apex, for me. So from the Visualforce I will invoke the controller which will actually invoke my proxy web service, which will actually invoke the SOAP web service from the third-party system. Now this will get a response. I will get a response from the server. I will wait for it. Once I get the response, I will write it back to Salesforce. So this is the whole flow when you are doing request and reply. Of course, there are limitations like first the request should be like small. If you have large chunk of data, it will fail because it takes time to process on the third-party system and also on the Salesforce to read it. Secondly, you can only open the connection for maximum 2 minutes. So if you are sending a request, it only waits until 2 minutes. If it's more than 2 minutes, it will time out. So that's the max limit. So that's the limitation on this. Of course, very important is error handling. So let's say if there is an error occurring, right? So there is an exception. So in this scenario, you will directly get that. You will get on the screen maybe an ugly message, or maybe you can process that to look it like beautiful that QuickBooks server is down, or like please enter the customer ID or whatever, right? So you can always do that. And for recovery, the good thing is like because the changes are not committed to Salesforce, so you can always fix the data and then you can try again. So this is the best practice in this. The second is, as I said, fire and forget. Okay, so maybe this is a good example. So let's say we, as I said, opportunity is closed one. You want to create an order in your WordPress website. Let's say you're using WordPress website for order management. So whenever the opportunity is closed one, you want to create an order in WordPress, right? Now in this scenario, let's say for me as a CEO, I don't need the order to be generated right away, but I'm still okay to have it like done in a, like I just want to somehow notify WordPress that please create an order, right? So in this scenario, I think the best practice should be the easiest way is outbound message, right? I should have like usually all the system has an endpoint URL which I can directly hit from outbound messaging. That so I can write a simple workflow. When the opportunity is closed one, fire the workflow. So it will fire the outbound message which should create an order in WordPress, for example. Again, in this scenario, I have no control whether the order was actually created in WordPress or not, but I at least know that I have submitted the request. So I will always guess like a success 200. But what happens after that is not under my control, right? The second, as I said, is again Visualforce page and all. But in this case, Visualforce is not good because it's asynchronous. So you are not committing data like in real time. You are actually using it at the future. So that means even if you create a Visualforce page, you are actually passing it as a asynchronous. So it doesn't even really matter if you should create a Visualforce page or not, because it's not an optimal way. It's still a good way, but I would not recommend that. Same applies for trigger. The same thing what you're doing from outbound message, you can do from trigger. You can use the trigger to, call an outbound URL or something, right, which will invoke the system, which is still good. Why is suboptimal is because outbound messaging doesn't require any code. You can directly call that. In trigger, you have to still create a piece of code. You have to write a test class and all those things. And lastly, as I said, for large chunk of data, you can always use batch Apex to send the data. So what you can do is you can write like a scheduled job which runs every hour to check for any new orders being created and push it to the third-party system. So that is a batch Apex. This is the flow. You had, there was a scenario where a record was created or updated. You simply, use a workflow rule to fire an outbound message, which actually sent a message to the remote listener. Now, as soon as I invoke the remote listener will tell me that okay, I've received the request. That's it. What it will do is it will actually place the request of mine to the queue for the remote system. Now, whenever the remote system will get chance, it will actually process that request, and that's it. It will process the request, but it's not notifying Salesforce that whether it has been created successfully or not. All right. So again, in this case, error handling is bit more difficult because call out only handles the exception on the initial invocation. Whatever happens after that, I'm not sure, right? So we need to do like a custom process which need to be written to roll back data or fire it again. So like in this case, what happens is even if I'm invoking order generation, like let's say in batch Apex or in request and forget, there might be still a process like a nightly job which brings back the order ID from the third-party system back to Salesforce, right? So if let's say after a day there is still no order created back in Salesforce, that means there was some issue. So what you can do is you can actually run a report and you can fire that sync again. Sure. The third is, as I said, batch data synchronization. So as I said, for example, you want to bring your SAP data to Salesforce, right? And whenever the data is updated in SAP, you want to update it back in Salesforce. So in this scenario, like the best scenario is to use a ETL tool like Informatica, Data Loader. There are other tools like Dell Boomi, like a lot of tools which you can use for syncing the data between third-party system to Salesforce. So that is the best practice in this. The other option is like remote call-in. So you can always write some custom integration between the third party to Salesforce, where whenever data is created in, let's say, SAP, just hit a URL of Salesforce, like a web service of Salesforce, to create it back in Salesforce. So that's another way of doing that. Like I personally have done one of the example where, so we have products created in WordPress website, okay, and they want to pull it back, all the products in Salesforce and all the orders which are created for that product back to Salesforce. So instead of writing all the custom integrations and all, what I did was I simply wrote a data loader IO job which actually connects the SQL server of the WordPress with Salesforce. So whenever the order is created in SQL server or in WordPress, it was bringing back to Salesforce. So there was no code involved. The whole integration was done in like 4 hours. Done. That's the best way. If you write the custom code, it will of course take you like 2 days, 3 days, whatever it is, with all the checking and all. This is the flow where like you have, like in this example, you initiate the process. You will check what happened. You can always put some filters that you don't need to push all the data, but only want to push some filtered data. Let's say only the records which don't have the order ID present. That means those have failed or never been pushed to the WordPress website, right? So you will pull those. Whichever data meets the criteria, you will simply write them to Salesforce. If there are any errors found, you will create an error file. If there is no error found, you will create a complete post, like you will create a finished process, right? So in this scenario, basically you're running, this is the ETL process you have set up. So you are reading the data from third-party system, you're writing it to Salesforce. You are writing like one by one. If there are any failures, you write it to the failure file. If there is success, you write it to the success file and finish. So in this case, how are you handling the error? So the best way is whenever the process is complete, simply fire the error file back to the developer saying that, hey, we ran this process, like 30 records failed, right? And how he recover that? He will simply read through the file. He will maybe fix the data, maybe there was, let's say we are syncing back to lead, and on lead last name was mandatory, or let's say company was mandatory. And in this scenario, there was no last name. So he can simply fix the data, or he can maybe write some rules in Salesforce to default the value of company to like not provided, or default the value of last name as not provided, which will now run this process automatically, right? Next of course is like remote call-in. So let's say taking a scenario where a customer signs up on your website and you want to create an account, contact, and all orders back in Salesforce, right? So for example, like you're syncing Shopify back to Salesforce. So as I said, in this case, you are pulling the data from Shopify to Salesforce. So that means, what you can do is you can use any of the API like REST API, SOAP API. You can write your own Apex web service. Now, why you will write our own Apex service, Apex web service? So let's say in this scenario, like in Salesforce, accounts and contacts are different, right? But let's say in Shopify, you only get customer, which has both account information and contact information. So what you can do is like in a single call, you have to create both account and contact. So for this, you can write like a custom web service, which you can invoke. You just pass the data, and in your web service, it will actually automatically create an account and a contact in the same transaction. Then of course you can similarly write Apex REST services, or you can write bulk API. Bulk API is usually used for large, long, like big chunk of data. Like I'm talking about like 50,000 records in one transaction. So for that you can use bulk API. So this is the process. So you had an event which occurred. So you will first log into Salesforce. Once you log in, you create a session ID. You will use the session ID, to query Salesforce. Once you are able to query Salesforce, you can do any of the DML operations like insert, delete, upsert, anything, right? And once that is done, you will simply pass the IDs back to Salesforce, back to the third-party system, saying that transaction has been done. In this, error handling is like there might be a chance there is a timeout. So you tried to push data to Salesforce, but there was a timeout. Because as I said, same way, Salesforce also keep the connection open for like 120 seconds, right? So if it's like more than that, it will try to fail it. So in that case, what you need to do is you have to write like a custom retry process. So keep on trying Salesforce unless it's succeeded. That's a custom remote call in. And the last one is, of course, as I said, is streaming API, which is amazing, which is cool. I haven't worked on it yet, but I have still read about it. So let's say it suits in this scenario. So let's say you are customer care, and a person calls you, says, hey, I want to make this booking. Okay, so you created let's say a lead or form for him, and you send a request to him. You send a URL to him that, okay, please make the payment. Now the customer is making the payment. Of course, customer can take 1 minute, he can take like 5 minutes to make the payment. So as a customer rep, what you have to do is you have to keep on refreshing the screen to make sure that whether the customer has paid or not. Now that is frustrating. So for that, what you can do is you can actually use the streaming API, in which you can create a you can create like a poll, okay, and you can send the poll and you can subscribe to it. So now whenever the customer will make the payment, in Salesforce, what we can do is we can create a small Visualforce page, which will be like an inline VF page. So as soon as the payment is made, automatically it will show you that, hey, payment has been made. So that means it will save a lot of your custom checking of APIs, because in this scenario, let's say I have to keep on refreshing the screen, or maybe clicking on the button, which will actually consume one of my API limit, one by one, which is frustrating. So in this case, it will be like automatic. It's not consuming any of your limit. So this is the scenario. You create a push topic with a query definition. You specify the event trigger, and you also create a Visualforce page and a JavaScript library, which you use for reading the response. So this was a scenario. You created a Visualforce UI, and you created a process. So you basically created a poll request, and you subscribe to that topic. Okay, you have subscribed to the topic. So whenever there is an event happened on the topic, you will automatically get a notification. So that means that something has happened. So in this case, you're not waiting, like you're not keep on checking it. The system is telling you, hey, something has happened. So now you can check it. The pros of it is, as I said, eliminates the need of writing custom polling mechanism, right? Or like there is no need of initial, like clicking on refresh. But the cons, and that's the only reason I have not used it. It says like, delivery of notification isn't guaranteed. So there might be a chance customer has paid, but you will never be notified. So you can keep on saying, hey, I never received your payment, but the customer has paid. So I think that is one of the reasons I haven't used it yet. Similarly, order of the notification is not guaranteed. So for example, you have placed 3 requests, so you don't know which request has been processed first. So you have to write your own, you have to pass some IDs or something to make sure that this transaction is for which, like this response is for which transaction, which is pretty hard to track. And notification are generated for the bulk API. So talking about like large data set, this approach is not useful. Okay, so that's pretty much it about the as I said, design patterns. So if you want to sync anything with Salesforce, these are the maximum possible scenarios which can happen. And one of the pattern fits to under its integration, right? So like for example, you want to sync Salesforce with MailChimp. So in this case, what I said is, I think the best way is, there is an app out there in App Store, simply install that. That's the easiest way. right? You don't even need to write a custom integration. Okay. Salesforce to QuickBooks syncs. Again, there is an app there, but let's say for some reason you have to create a custom integration. In this scenario, you have to use both, something can be like real time and something can be, asynchronous, So for example, whenever the customer is created in QuickBooks, you want to bring it back to Salesforce, it doesn't need to be like real time. But whenever invoice is created in Salesforce, you want to push it to QuickBooks in real time. So in this case, we have to follow both the patterns in the whole transaction. So we are doing real time as well as we are also doing asynchronous for this integration. Salesforce Twilio sync, as I said, in this case, because the message takes time, it cannot be like a real time transaction. So it has to be like, request and forget. So you just hope that it has sent the message, and then maybe every hour or every 5 minutes you can keep on checking the status of the message, whether you have received the message or not. Of course, there are other ways as well. In Twilio, you can create like a callback URL. So whenever the SMS has been sent, you can actually invoke a callback URL from Salesforce, like to Salesforce, so that Salesforce knows that SMS has been sent. So there are other ways around that, as an hack. And lastly, of course, there are some special scenarios which always come, for which none of these approach will work. So like in this scenario, this is one of my recent case which I found. Maybe if you have any solution, let me know. But in my scenario, what I had to do is I had to generate a NACHA file, so the whole process was I need to link Salesforce with banks. So I need to generate a NACHA file from Salesforce and I need to FTP that to the bank. Now, in Salesforce, you can create a file, but you cannot FTP the file. And then correct me if I'm wrong, right? We cannot create a FTP connection. So in this case, what I had to do is I have to create a middleware. So now this middleware is actually reading the file from Salesforce, and it was FTPing that to the third-party system. So in this scenario, I have to use a middleware. Of course, there are many other scenarios where you have to put a middleware in between. But mostly, what I recommend is to have like a, without using a middleware, you should have like a direct integration, because the more middleware you have in place, it's hard to track the errors, right? So yeah, I think this pretty much, I know it's a gist of the whole integration, but frankly, the whole integration surrounds around it. I think there is no other scenario which can occur. If you have any, please throw it to me and I can think about that. Any questions? Yeah. Sure.
So obviously you do custom integrations, I suspect, as part of your services. Do you ever use any integration tools other than Salesforce Connect is an obvious one built into the platform, but AppExchange products that provide a framework for doing complex integrations?
Yeah, there are many platforms available. I'm not able to recall name, but if you go to any Salesforce conference, there are a lot of booths which allows you to create the custom integration like Zapier or I think there are many of them. I keep on CRM, Spring CM or something. There are many of them. So I think they are also great. But having said that, in most cases, what I'm seeing is, of course, 90% of scenarios are covered by them, but there are still some edge cases for which you have to write a custom integration. Yeah. Any other? I know it's sleeping time for everyone. So, any other question? Yeah.
You didn't mention platform events. Have you tried to use platform events yet?
No, unfortunately not. And thank you for that. I will look into that. But yeah, you want to give a small overview on that? What's that?
Well, what I finished one and it worked pretty well, and it's similar to streaming, where you just publish events, and it's especially useful if you have more than one party who might be interested in the data that's been sent. So, like in your scenario, you had point-to-point integrations, but if you had 3 and you wanted to have, then the number of point-to-points kind of grows geometrically as you add people. Mm-hmm. And with platform events, you can kind of just put the data out there, and then you can have decoupled subscribers just consume what they want. So it's pretty cool.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, and I can expand on that and give you a real-world example of that that I'm literally working on. I was working on as I walked in today. So I've got a Twilio-based SMS text app that just launched yesterday on AppExchange, and as part of my administration of that, when I get a new subscriber, right, a subscription is created in my org by AppExchange, and actually it comes through Stripe. And when that subscription happens, there's a trigger that I fire that makes a call out to Twilio to create a sub-account and to return the account SID
token.
and the auth token.
Right.
Okay. Well, from a trigger, you have to do an app future method, right? Because it can't do a call out. So I call out an app future method, but I need to get back. An app future method has got to be void, right? So that's where I'm using a platform event. In that app future method, I'm basically setting a variable equal to the call out. And then when I get that call out message back, the next line, I'm firing off a platform event that contains that data. So it's a void method, but it's firing out a platform event that I've got another trigger subscribed to take it and do stuff with it.
Oh, perfect, cool, yeah.
So it's kind of almost like the streaming API, but it's avoiding a couple of the sort of hangups in
Sure, yeah. What's the name of the app?
Proton Text.
Proton Text? Okay, guys, try it out. Sure. Any other query? See, I explained everything, right? Everyone is clear.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a little time to hang out then. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks.